The wind carried the scent of death across the valley, mingling with the acrid smoke that rose from the charred remains of what had once been a home. Martha Martin stood at the edge of the cemetery, her black dress billowing around her swollen form, one hand pressed protectively against her rounded belly, while the other gripped a wilted bouquet of wildflowers. The wooden cross marking her husband's grave bore fresh scratches from the storm that had raged 3 nights prior, the same storm that had claimed 2 more lives in their small frontier town of Cedar Ridge. 6 months pregnant and utterly alone, Martha felt the weight of countless stares boring into her back. The townspeople had gathered for yet another funeral, this one for Rebecca Walsh, who had lasted exactly 23 days after her husband's death, before succumbing to what the doctor called a broken heart, but what Martha knew was something far more sinister. Rebecca had been the fourth pregnant widow in as many months to die under mysterious circumstances, each death occurring within weeks of their husband's passing. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, though no one dared speak it aloud. First had been Eleanor Blackwood, found at the bottom of Miller's Creek with her unborn child still moving in her womb. Then Sarah Hendricks, discovered in her locked cabin with no signs of struggle but her face twisted in terror. Next came Margaret Stone, who simply never woke up one morning, her lips blue and her fingers clutched around a locket containing her husband's photograph. And now Rebecca, the youngest of them all at barely 19, lay in the ground beside her husband's fresh grave. Martha pressed her lips together, tasting salt and ash on the autumn air. The preacher's voice droned on about eternal rest and divine mercy, but his words felt hollow against the growing dread that had settled over Cedar Ridge like a suffocating blanket. She could feel the eyes of the other mourners tracking her movements, calculating how long she might have left, placing bets on whether she would see Christmas or if her child would ever draw breath outside her womb. The truth was that Martha had been preparing for her own death since the day they lowered her husband Daniel into the ground. Daniel Perez had been a good man, a carpenter who built sturdy homes and treated everyone with kindness, regardless of their station in life. He had died protecting their neighbors' livestock from a pack of wolves, taking 3 bullets meant for the animals before the beast finally retreated into the darkness. His sacrifice had saved dozens of cattle and horses, ensuring the town's survival through the coming winter. But it had left Martha completely defenseless in a world that seemed determined to claim pregnant widows. She had noticed the changes immediately after Daniel's funeral. Shopkeepers who had once greeted her warmly now avoided her gaze. Women who had been friends crossed the street rather than walk beside her. Even the children seemed to sense something wrong, pointing and whispering when they thought she could not see. It was as if widowhood had marked her with some invisible curse that made others fear for their own safety simply by being near her. The preacher concluded his sermon with a final prayer for Rebecca's soul, and the crowd began to disperse. Martha remained motionless beside Daniel's grave, watching as families hurried away in small groups, their voices low and urgent as they discussed the latest tragedy. She knew they were talking about her, wondering if she would be next, speculating about what force was claiming these women and their unborn children with such ruthless efficiency. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. As the last of the mourners disappeared down the hill toward town, Martha found herself alone among the weathered headstones. The cemetery sat on a rise overlooking Cedar Ridge, offering a clear view of the main street with its handful of businesses and the scattered homes that dotted the valley floor. Smoke rose from chimneys as families prepared their evening meals, and she could see children playing in the dusty road despite their parents' calls to come inside before dark. It was a peaceful scene that belied the terror that had gripped the community. Cedar Ridge had always been a hard place to live, carved out of unforgiving wilderness by men and women who refused to bend to the elements or the dangers that lurked beyond the tree line. They had survived Indian raids, harsh winters, disease outbreaks, and economic hardships that had driven other settlements to abandon their claims and retreat to more civilized territories. But this new threat was different, more insidious than anything they had faced before. Martha turned her attention back to Daniel's grave, kneeling carefully beside the wooden cross to place her wilted flowers against the freshly turned earth. The baby stirred within her, a gentle flutter that reminded her of butterfly wings against glass. At 6 months, the child was large enough that she could feel distinct movements, tiny hands and feet pressing against the walls of her womb as if already eager to escape into the world. She wondered if the baby somehow sensed the danger that surrounded them, if the fear that kept her awake at night was being transmitted through her blood into the developing life she carried. The sound of approaching footsteps made her tense, and she looked up to see Kenneth Lee walking toward her through the gathering dusk. Kenneth was an enigma in Cedar Ridge, a man who had arrived 3 years earlier with no explanation of his past and no apparent desire to form connections with his neighbors. He lived alone in a cabin on the outskirts of town, worked as a blacksmith and occasional tracker, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. Most people found his silence and intense gaze unsettling, but Martha had always sensed something protective rather than threatening in his demeanor. Kenneth was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and hands that bore the permanent stains of his trade. His dark hair was always kept short and neat, and his clothes, while simple, were clean and well maintained. There was something almost military in his bearing, a discipline and awareness that suggested training beyond what most frontier men possessed. His eyes, a pale gray that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing, had been watching Martha more frequently since Daniel's death. He stopped a respectful distance away, removing his hat in deference to the sacred ground. He said, his voice low and carefully modulated, quote, "Why?" Martha struggled to her feet, accepting the hand he offered without thinking. His grip was firm and warm, steadying her as she regained her balance. "Quote, she replied, smoothing her dress over her rounded belly. "Quote, Shawam." Kenneth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She was the fourth," he said simply. The blunt statement hung between them like a challenge. Martha studied his face, searching for some hint of his thoughts behind those inscrutable gray eyes. "You have been counting," she observed. "Someone needs to," Kenneth replied. "The sheriff seems content to call them coincidences. The doctor speaks of weak constitutions and the strain of grief, but you know better, do you not?" It was not a question, and Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What do you think is happening to them?" Kenneth glanced around the cemetery, his gaze lingering on the fresh graves of the other widows before returning to her face. "I think someone is hunting pregnant widows," he said quietly, "and I think you are next on their list." The words struck Martha like a physical blow, even though they only confirmed what she had been thinking for weeks. Hearing them spoken aloud by someone else made the threat feel more real, more immediate. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to contain the trembling that had started in her hands and was spreading through her entire body. "Why?" she whispered. "What could anyone gain from killing women who have already lost everything?" Kenneth replaced his hat, his movements deliberate and controlled. "That is what I intend to find out," he said. "But first, I need to make sure you survive long enough for me to discover the truth." Martha stared at him, uncertain whether to feel grateful or terrified by his offer of protection. Kenneth Lee was virtually a stranger, a man whose past remained shrouded in mystery and whose motivations were unclear. Yet he was also the only person in Cedar Ridge who seemed willing to acknowledge the pattern of deaths, let alone do something about it. The other townspeople had retreated into denial and superstition, whispering about curses and divine punishment while doing nothing to protect the remaining pregnant widows. "I do not understand," Martha said. "Why would you want to help me? You barely know me." Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the lights of the town below. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested painful memories. "I have seen what happens when good people die because others choose to look away," he said. "I will not let it happen again." There was something in his tone that made Martha believe him, a conviction that went beyond mere neighborly concern. She sensed that Kenneth Lee carried his own ghosts, his own reasons for wanting to protect her that had little to do with her specifically and everything to do with promises made to people who were no longer alive to hold him accountable. The baby moved again, a more vigorous kick that made Martha gasp and press her hand to her side. Kenneth's attention immediately focused on her, his body tensing as if preparing for action. The intensity of his reaction surprised her, the way he seemed to interpret every sound and movement as a potential threat. "Quote 19, Martha explained, offering a weak smile. "Quote 20. Kenneth's expression softened slightly at the mention of her late husband. "Daniel Perez was a good man," he said. "He spoke well of you." Martha felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been weeks since anyone had mentioned Daniel in her presence, as if his death had somehow erased him from the collective memory of Cedar Ridge. You knew him? He helped me repair my forge last spring when the bellows broke, Kenneth replied. Would not accept payment, said neighbors should help neighbors without expectation of reward. He was proud of you, spoke often of the child you were carrying. The tears came freely now, and Martha did not try to stop them. It felt good to hear Daniel's name spoken with respect, to know that someone remembered him as more than just another casualty of frontier life. Kenneth stood quietly beside her, not offering empty words of comfort, but simply bearing witness to her grief. As the last light faded from the sky, Martha realized that she was facing a choice that would determine not only her own fate, but that of her unborn child. She could return to her empty cabin and wait for whatever force was claiming pregnant widows to find her, or she could trust this enigmatic stranger who claimed he wanted to protect her. Neither option offered any guarantee of safety, but at least one provided hope. Martha asked finally. Kenneth turned to face her fully, his gray eyes reflecting the first stars that were beginning to appear overhead. He said, the suggestion was scandalous by the standards of Cedar Ridge society. An unmarried man and a pregnant widow living under the same roof would provide enough gossip to fuel conversations for months. But Martha was beyond caring about social conventions when her life and her child's life hung in the balance. The townspeople will talk, she said. Let them, Kenneth replied. Their opinions will not matter if you are dead. Martha considered his words, weighing the risks against the alternatives. Staying alone in her cabin felt like signing her own death warrant, especially now that the pattern had become so clear. At least with Kenneth, she would have someone watching for danger, someone who seemed to understand the threat they were facing. There would need to be conditions, Martha said slowly, arrangements to protect both our reputations. Kenneth nodded. I will sleep in the barn. You will have complete privacy in the cabin. I ask only that you not venture outside alone and that you trust me to make decisions about your safety. The terms seemed reasonable, though Martha wondered how long such an arrangement could last. Her pregnancy was advancing, and she would eventually need medical attention that Kenneth could not provide. But perhaps they only needed to survive long enough to identify the killer and put an end to the murders that had terrorized Cedar Ridge. Very well, Martha said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. When do we begin? Tonight, Kenneth replied without hesitation. I will escort you to your cabin to gather what you need. Then we will return to my place before full darkness falls. Martha felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as they made their way down the hill toward town. Kenneth walked beside her, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of danger. She noticed that he kept one hand near the gun on his hip, and his movements had the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. It occurred to her that she knew nothing about Kenneth Lee's background, nothing about what had brought him to Cedar Ridge, or what skills he possessed that might help protect her. The main street was nearly deserted as they approached Martha's cabin, most families having retreated indoors for the evening meal. A few windows glowed with lamplight, and she could hear the distant sound of children's laughter from one of the houses. It seemed impossible that such normalcy could coexist with the terror that had claimed 4 women in as many months. Martha's cabin sat at the end of a row of modest homes that Daniel had helped build when they first arrived in Cedar Ridge. It was a simple structure with 2 rooms and a small loft, but Daniel had taken pride in the details, carving decorative trim around the windows and building sturdy furniture that would last for generations. Now the cabin felt like a tomb, filled with memories of a life that had been cut tragically short. Kenneth waited outside while Martha gathered her belongings, packing only the essentials in a worn carpet bag that had belonged to her mother. She included her few remaining pieces of jewelry, the letters Daniel had written during their courtship, and the baby clothes she had been sewing in preparation for the birth. Everything else would have to remain behind, silent witnesses to the happiness she had once known. As she moved through the rooms, Martha found herself listening for sounds that might indicate danger. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind against the windows made her heart race. She realized that she had been living in a state of constant fear since Daniel's death, jumping at shadows and starting at unexpected noises. The thought of spending even one more night alone in this place filled her with dread. When she emerged from the cabin with her bag, Kenneth was standing in the exact same position she had left him, his attention focused on the surrounding darkness. He took the bag from her hands and gestured for her to stay close as they began walking toward the outskirts of town. Martha said as they walked, quote 40. Kenneth was quiet for several steps before answering. Quote 41. Martha shivered despite the warmth of the evening. Quote 42. Quote 40, Kenneth agreed. Quote 44, the implications were chilling. It suggested that the killer was someone familiar with the town and its residents, someone who could observe the widows without arousing suspicion. Martha found herself looking at every shadow with new suspicion, wondering if unseen eyes were tracking their movements even now. Kenneth's cabin stood in a small clearing about a mile from the main settlement, surrounded by tall pines that provided natural concealment. It was larger than Martha had expected, built with the same attention to detail that Daniel had favored. The structure was solid and well-maintained, with a stone chimney that promised warmth during the cold months ahead. I built it myself, Kenneth said, noticing her surprise. I prefer privacy. He led her inside, lighting a lamp that revealed a surprisingly comfortable interior. The main room contained a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with books. Martha was intrigued by the books, which suggested an education beyond what most frontier men possessed. She could see titles on military strategy, medicine, and what appeared to be law enforcement procedures. You have quite a library, Martha observed. Kenneth followed her gaze to the shelves. Knowledge is a weapon like any other, he said simply, sometimes more effective than guns or knives. He showed her to a small bedroom that was clean and simply furnished with a bed, dresser, and washstand. A window looked out over the clearing, providing a view of anyone approaching the cabin. Kenneth had clearly chosen the location with defense in mind. I will be in the barn if you need anything, Kenneth said. There is a bell on the nightstand. Ring it if you hear anything unusual or if you feel unwell. Martha nodded, suddenly feeling awkward about the arrangement they had agreed to. She was essentially placing her life in the hands of a man she barely knew, trusting him with not only her own safety, but that of her unborn child. Yet what choice did she have? The alternative was to wait alone for death to find her. After Kenneth left for the barn, Martha sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. Just that morning, she had been preparing to attend Rebecca Walsh's funeral, going through the motions of grief and sympathy while secretly calculating her own chances of survival. Now she was in a stranger's cabin, under the protection of a man whose past remained a mystery. The baby stirred within her, and Martha placed both hands on her belly, feeling the reassuring movement of tiny limbs. What have I gotten us into, little one? She whispered. I hope I am making the right choice. Outside, she could hear Kenneth moving around the barn, the soft sounds of someone settling in for the night. There was something comforting about knowing he was nearby, even if she was not entirely certain she could trust him. At least she was no longer alone with her fears. Martha prepared for bed, changing into a simple nightgown and braiding her dark hair. The routine activities helped calm her nerves, providing a sense of normalcy in what had become an increasingly surreal situation. She extinguished the lamp and lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin as she listened to the night sounds of the forest. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of faceless figures moving through the darkness and the sound of women crying in the distance. Each time she woke, Martha found herself listening for Kenneth's presence in the barn, reassured by the knowledge that someone was watching over her. It was the first time since Daniel's death that she had felt even marginally safe. Dawn arrived gray and overcast, with thick clouds that promised rain before the day was through. Martha woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting through the cabin, evidence that Kenneth was already up and preparing breakfast. She dressed quickly, smoothing her hair and checking her appearance in the small mirror above the washstand. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Kenneth standing at the stove, his movements efficient and practiced as he tended to the cooking. He had changed into clean clothes and appeared to have slept well despite spending the night in the barn. There was something almost domestic about the scene, which made Martha feel both grateful and uncomfortable. Good morning, Kenneth said without turning around. I trust you slept better than you have in recent weeks. Martha was surprised by his perceptiveness. How did you know? You have the look of someone who has not been sleeping well, Kenneth replied, transferring eggs from the pan to a plate. Dark circles under your eyes, tension in your shoulders. Fear has a way of marking people. He set the plate before her along with a cup of coffee, then took his own seat across the table. Martha realized that it had been weeks since anyone had cooked for her, and this simple gesture brought tears to her eyes. She had been surviving on bread and preserved foods, too exhausted and frightened to prepare proper meals. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Kenneth nodded but did not respond, focusing his attention on his own breakfast. Martha sensed that he was uncomfortable with gratitude, as if kindness was something he offered without expectation of acknowledgement or reward. It made her wonder what experiences had shaped him, what losses might have driven him to this isolated existence. As they ate, Martha became aware of the sounds outside the cabin. Kenneth's attention never fully left the windows and doors, his body language suggesting constant readiness for action. She realized that protection meant more than simply offering shelter. It meant maintaining vigilance against threats that could materialize at any moment. "Code 61, Martha asked. Kenneth set down his coffee cup and met her gaze directly. "Quote 62, he said. Quote 63. Martha felt a chill at the clinical way he discussed the deaths. Defiarm. Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, and Martha saw something flicker across his features that might have been pain or regret. "Good time, he said finally. "Kodashon." The admission raised more questions than it answered, but Martha sensed that pushing for details would be counterproductive. Kenneth Lee was clearly a man with secrets, and those secrets were part of what made him capable of protecting her. She would have to be content with partial truths and trust that his motivations were honorable. Quote 67, Martha asked. Quote 68, Kenneth replied. Quote 60, Martha thought back to her interactions with Eleanor, Sarah, Margaret, and Rebecca. They had been acquaintances rather than close friends, but she had spoken with each of them at various social gatherings and community events. Now she tried to recall those conversations with new perspective, searching for clues that might have seemed insignificant at the time. Martha said slowly. Quote 71. Kenneth's expression darkened. What kind of animals lurk near cabins and watch people? That is what Eleanor asked. Martha replied. The sheriff said grief could make people imagine things that were not there. And the others? Martha searched her memory for similar details. Sarah Hendricks was having trouble sleeping. She said she kept hearing sounds outside her cabin, footsteps that would stop whenever she tried to look out the windows. Margaret Stone mentioned that someone had been asking questions about her, wanting to know when her baby was due and whether she had family coming to help with the birth. Kenneth leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Who was asking these questions? She did not say, Martha admitted. I assumed it was just neighbors being concerned, but now I wonder if it was something more sinister. And Rebecca Walsh? Martha felt tears threaten again as she remembered the young woman's frightened face at her husband's funeral. Rebecca was terrified. She begged me not to leave her alone after the burial, said she felt like something terrible was going to happen. I stayed with her for a few hours, but eventually I had to go home. She died 3 days later. The pattern was becoming clearer with each detail Martha provided. Someone had been systematically stalking these women, learning their routines and vulnerabilities before striking. The fact that Sheriff Collins had dismissed their concerns as grief-induced paranoia suggested either incompetence or something more troubling. Tell me about Sheriff Collins, Kenneth said, as if reading her thoughts. Martha considered her words carefully. Lionel Collins had been sheriff of Cedar Ridge for nearly 10 years, elected repeatedly by townspeople who valued his connections to the territorial government more than his law enforcement skills. He was a politician first and a lawman second, more concerned with maintaining order and avoiding controversy than with protecting individual citizens. He is not a bad man, Martha said diplomatically, but he prefers simple explanations to complicated investigations. The idea that someone might be deliberately targeting pregnant widows would require him to take action, and action might involve risk. Kenneth's jaw tightened. Quote, if we have, quote, and Martha agreed. Quote 87. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Kenneth was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun as he peered out the window. Martha felt her heart begin to race, wondering if their hiding place had already been discovered. Quote 88, Kenneth said, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Quote 9. Martha knew Dr. Anthony Morris by reputation rather than personal experience. He was a relatively young man who had arrived in Cedar Ridge 2 years earlier, claiming to have received his medical training back east. He had quickly established a practice and earned the trust of the community, though some whispered that his methods were unconventional and his bedside manner somewhat cold. Kenneth opened the door as Dr. Morris dismounted from his horse. The doctor was a thin man with prematurely gray hair and pale eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of his own thoughts. He carried a black medical bag and wore the serious expression of someone bearing important news. Dr. Morris said formally, "Quote 91. Kenneth stepped aside to allow the doctor entry, though Martha noticed he kept his hand near his weapon. Quote 92. Dr. Morris glanced between Kenneth and Martha, his expression unreadable. Quote 93. Martha felt a mixture of gratitude and suspicion at the doctor's unexpected visit. While it was thoughtful of him to be concerned about her health, she wondered how Sheriff Collins had learned of her arrangement with Kenneth so quickly. The news suggested that their movements were being watched more closely than they had realized. "I am fine, Dr. Morris," Martha said. "Mr. Lee has been very kind." Dr. Morris nodded but continued to study her with those pale, assessing eyes. "Nevertheless, I would like to examine you, if you do not mind. Given what has happened to the other expectant mothers in our community, I think regular medical supervision would be wise." The offer seemed reasonable, yet something about the doctor's manner made Martha uncomfortable. There was an intensity to his gaze that felt invasive, as if he were evaluating her for purposes beyond simple medical care. She glanced at Kenneth and saw that he was watching the doctor with equal wariness. Martha said carefully. Dr. Morris smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. He said, the words carried an undertone that suggested the examination was not entirely optional. Martha found herself caught between social convention, which demanded that she submit to medical authority, and instinct, which warned her that something was not right about this situation. Kenneth stepped closer to Martha, his presence both protective and reassuring. Quote 101, he suggested. Dr. Morris turned his attention to Kenneth, and Martha saw something flicker across his features that might have been annoyance or calculation. Quote 102, and the tension in the room was palpable, two men facing off over Martha's right to refuse an unwanted examination. She realized that this moment might reveal important information about both men, their true motivations, and the extent to which she could trust either of them. I would prefer to wait, Martha said firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. If I need medical attention, I will send word. Dr. Morris's smile became strained. Quote 105, he said. Quote 106. The warning felt more like a threat, and Martha saw Kenneth's hand move closer to his gun. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the air thick with unspoken menace. She realized that by refusing the examination, she might have revealed something important about the doctor's true intentions. Code 107. Martha replied, her voice steady despite the fear that was building in her chest. Dr. Morris gathered his medical bag and moved toward the door. He said, quote 108, quote, after the doctor left, Kenneth immediately moved to the window to watch him ride away. His entire body was tense, and Martha could see that the encounter had confirmed some suspicion he had been harboring. Martha asked. Kenneth turned from the window, his gray eyes hard as steel. He said, the implication sent a chill through Martha's entire body. If the town doctor was involved in the murders, then the threat was even more insidious than they had imagined. It would explain how the killer had been able to approach his victims without arousing suspicion, how he had known their conditions and vulnerabilities. What do we do now? Martha whispered. Kenneth checked his gun and moved to secure the cabin door. Now we assume that everyone in Cedar Ridge is a potential threat, he said grimly, and we prepare for the possibility that the killer knows exactly where to find you. The morning after Dr. Morris's unexpected visit brought with it a sense of impending danger that seemed to permeate every corner of Kenneth's cabin. Martha woke to find him already dressed and checking his weapons, his movements sharp and efficient as he prepared for what he clearly expected to be a difficult day. The sight of him loading his rifle sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the cabin walls. We cannot stay here much longer, Kenneth said without looking up from his task. Morris knows where you are, which means others will know soon enough. This cabin was meant to be temporary shelter, not a fortress. Martha pressed her hands to her swollen belly, feeling the baby's restless movements beneath her palms. At nearly 7 months pregnant, when she was growing more cumbersome by the day, her body betraying her need for mobility and speed. The thought of running again, of abandoning even this small measure of safety, filled her with a despair that threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kenneth finally met her gaze, and she saw something in his gray eyes that might have been regret or determination. He said slowly, the prospect of spending months in complete isolation, cut off from any semblance of civilization, should have terrified Martha. Instead, she found herself considering the option with something approaching relief. At least in the wilderness, they would know where the dangers were coming from. Wild animals and harsh weather were threats she could understand, unlike the human predator that stalked the pregnant widows of Cedar Ridge. Quote 122. Martha asked practically. Quote 123. Kenneth's expression darkened slightly. That is the problem we need to solve today, he said. We need to gather what we can without arousing suspicion, and we need to do it before anyone realizes what we are planning. The task seemed impossible. Martha's pregnancy was too advanced to hide, and Kenneth's sudden departure from town would certainly be noticed and remarked upon. They would need help, someone they could trust to provide supplies and perhaps misdirection to cover their escape. The problem was identifying such a person in a community where trust had become a luxury none of them could afford. As if reading her thoughts, Kenneth moved to the window and gazed out at the forest that surrounded his cabin. There is someone who might be willing to help, he said reluctantly. Catherine Ramirez runs the general store. She has always been fair in her dealings, and she has reason to distrust the current situation in town. Martha knew Catherine by sight, if not by close acquaintance. She was a widow herself, though not pregnant, which had apparently placed her outside the killer's area of interest. Catherine had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 years earlier with her late husband, establishing the general store that had become essential to the community's survival. She was known for her shrewd business sense and her reluctance to involve herself in local politics or gossip. What makes you think she would help us? Martha asked. Kenneth turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. Her husband died under circumstances that were never fully explained, he said. A hunting accident, according to Sheriff Collins. But there were details that did not add up. Catherine has never accepted the official explanation, and she has made it clear that she has little faith in the sheriff's investigative abilities. The implication was intriguing. If Catherine Ramirez harbored suspicions about her own husband's death, she might be more willing to believe that the recent deaths of pregnant widows were not coincidental. She might even have information that could help them identify the killer. Quote 131. Martha asked. Kenneth considered the question for several minutes, his gaze distant as he worked through various scenarios. Quote 132, he said finally. Quote 133. The plan was risky, but Martha could see no alternative that offered better chances of success. They needed allies if they were going to survive, and Catherine Ramirez represented their best hope of finding someone trustworthy in a town that had become increasingly dangerous. The day passed slowly, with Kenneth maintaining constant vigilance while Martha tried to rest and conserve her strength for whatever lay ahead. She found herself thinking about the other widows, wondering if they had sensed the danger closing in around them in their final days. Had Eleanor Blackwood known that her fears were justified when she reported being watched? Had Rebecca Walsh understood that her terror was a rational response to a very real threat? The baby's movements had become more pronounced, as if the child somehow sensed the tension that surrounded them. Martha found herself talking to her unborn son or daughter, promising that they would find safety, that they would survive whatever trials lay ahead. The promises felt hollow even as she spoke them, but they provided a small measure of comfort in an increasingly hopeless situation. As afternoon faded into evening, Kenneth prepared to leave for town. He checked his weapons one final time and gave Martha careful instructions about what to do if he did not return by midnight. The possibility of being abandoned in the wilderness, alone and pregnant, was terrifying, but Martha forced herself to memorize every detail of his contingency plans. If something happens to me, Kenneth said, take the horse and head north toward Copper Creek. Follow the old mining road until you reach the abandoned homestead I described. There are supplies cached there, enough to last through winter if you are careful. Martha nodded, though she doubted her ability to survive alone in the wilderness while heavily pregnant. What if the killer finds me here while you are gone? Kenneth's jaw tightened. He said grimly. The words were harsh, but Martha found them oddly comforting. Kenneth's willingness to arm her and trust her with her own defense suggested a respect for her capabilities that few men would have shown. In a world where women were often treated as helpless creatures in need of constant protection, his confidence in her ability to fight for her life was both empowering and terrifying. After Kenneth left, Martha settled into the vigil that had become routine over the past few days. She kept the rifle within easy reach and positioned herself where she could observe the approaches to the cabin while remaining hidden from outside view. The forest around Kenneth's property was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning their nightly hunts, a reminder that danger took many forms in the wilderness. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Martha found herself starting at every sound, her imagination transforming innocent wildlife into human threats. The baby seemed to sense her anxiety, moving restlessly within her womb as if trying to escape the tension that gripped her body. She tried to remain calm for the child's sake, but fear had become her constant companion. It was nearly 10 o'clock when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Martha's heart began to race as she moved to the window, rifle in hand, trying to identify the source of the noise. The footsteps were too heavy to belong to Kenneth, and they were coming from the wrong direction. Someone was approaching the cabin from the east, moving through the trees with the careful deliberation of a hunter stalking prey. Martha's hands trembled as she raised the rifle, trying to remember Kenneth's instructions about aiming and breathing. The weapon felt impossibly heavy in her arms, and she wondered if she would actually be able to pull the trigger when the moment came. The thought of taking another human life, even in self-defense, filled her with revulsion. But the alternative was to become another victim in the string of murders that had terrorized Cedar Ridge. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin, and Martha held her breath as she waited to see what would happen next. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then, without warning, someone began testing the door handle, turning it slowly as if trying to determine whether the cabin was locked. Martha bit back a cry of terror as the handle turned completely and the door began to creak open. Kenneth had secured the door before leaving, which meant that whoever was outside had somehow managed to unlock it or had found another way inside. The possibility that the intruder possessed keys to the cabin suggested someone with intimate knowledge of Kenneth's property and habits. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the starlight filtering through the trees. Martha could not make out the person's features, but the size and shape suggested a man of medium build. He stood motionless for several seconds, apparently listening for sounds from within the cabin, before stepping across the threshold and closing the door behind him. "Mrs. Martin," a familiar voice called softly. "I know you are here. There is no point in hiding." Martha's blood turned to ice as she recognized the voice of Dr. Anthony Morris. The man who was supposed to heal and protect the people of Cedar Ridge had come to her refuge in the middle of the night, and his presence could only mean one thing. Kenneth's suspicions had been correct, and she was now face to face with the killer who had claimed the lives of 4 pregnant women. "I am not here to hurt you," Dr. Morris continued, his tone reasonable and calm. "I simply want to complete the examination I attempted yesterday. Your condition requires medical attention, and I am concerned that delay could result in complications." The words were spoken with the same professional authority he had used during his visit to the cabin. But now Martha could hear the underlying menace. Dr. Morris was not here as a healer, but as a predator, and his medical knowledge made him infinitely more dangerous than an ordinary killer. He would know exactly how to cause death while making it appear natural. How to eliminate both mother and child without leaving evidence of murder. Martha remained frozen behind her hiding place, afraid that even the slightest movement would reveal her location. The rifle in her hands felt like both salvation and damnation, offering protection at the cost of forcing her to become something she had never imagined herself capable of being. The baby moved within her womb as if sensing the danger that had surrounded them both. "I know this must be frightening," Dr. Morris said, moving deeper into the cabin. "The other women were frightened too at first, but I want you to understand that what I do is necessary. Cedar Ridge cannot support an unlimited population, and resources are already stretched to their limits. The children you carry would only add to the burden, competing for food and shelter that are needed by those already here. The casual admission of multiple murders sent a wave of nausea through Martha's body. Dr. Morris was not simply a killer, but someone who had convinced himself that his actions were justified, even beneficial to the community. The rational tone of his voice made his words even more chilling, suggesting a mind that had completely divorced itself from normal human empathy. Quote 145, Dr. Morris continued, apparently confident that Martha was listening even if she had not revealed herself. Quote 146, Martha closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing as Dr. Morris moved through the cabin, searching for her hiding place. She could hear him opening doors and moving furniture, methodically checking every possible location where she might be concealed. It was only a matter of time before he found her, and she would have to decide whether to surrender or fight. The sound of his footsteps approaching her hiding place galvanized Martha into action. She rose from behind the overturned table where she had been crouching and leveled the rifle at Dr. Morris's chest, her finger trembling on the trigger. The doctor stopped in surprise, his pale eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the cabin windows. "Stay back," Martha said, her voice stronger than she had expected. "I know what you have done to the other women, and I will not let you do the same to me." Dr. Morris smiled, apparently untroubled by the weapon pointed at his heart. "Mrs. Martin, surely you do not intend to shoot an unarmed man who is only trying to help you. Put down the rifle before you hurt yourself or your baby." The condescending tone infuriated Martha, giving her strength she had not known she possessed. "You murdered Eleanor Blackwood, Sarah Hendricks, Margaret Stone, and Rebecca Walsh," she said firmly. "You killed their babies before they could be born. You are not here to help me, you are here to murder me." Dr. Morris's expression shifted slightly, losing some of its false concern and revealing something colder underneath. He said dismissively. The casual cruelty of his words strengthened Martha's resolve. She had seen the terror in Rebecca Walsh's eyes, had heard the fear in Eleanor Blackwood's voice when she spoke of being watched. These women had not been weak. They had been victims of a monster who used his medical authority to justify murder. "You are insane," Martha said, keeping the rifle trained on his chest. These were innocent women who had already lost their husbands. They deserved protection, not death. Dr. Morris took a step closer, apparently testing her resolve. "Innocent?" He laughed softly. "Eleanor Blackwood was carrying the child of a man who was not her husband. Sarah Hendricks had been drinking heavily since her husband's death, poisoning the child in her womb. Margaret Stone was too old to safely carry a baby, and Rebecca Walsh was little more than a child herself. I saved them from lives of misery and shame." Martha's finger tightened on the trigger as Dr. Morris revealed the depth of his delusions. He had convinced himself that murder was mercy, that eliminating pregnant widows was somehow protecting them from future suffering. The twisted logic made him even more dangerous, because he genuinely believed his actions were justified. "What do that?" Martha asked. Quote, Dr. Morris's smile widened, and Martha saw something genuinely mad in his pale eyes. "You are different," he admitted. "Stronger than the others, more determined to survive. That makes you dangerous, a threat to the natural order that keeps communities like Cedar Ridge stable. Strong women who refuse to accept their place create problems for everyone." The admission revealed the true motivation behind the murders. Dr. Morris was not simply eliminating what he saw as genetic weakness. He was targeting women who threatened his vision of how society should function. Martha's refusal to submit to his authority, her decision to seek protection rather than accept her fate, had marked her as a particular threat that needed to be eliminated. Quote 162, Martha said, hoping to buy time and perhaps discourage the doctor from attempting violence. Quote 163, Dr. Morris shook his head sadly, as if disappointed by her naivety. Quote 164, he said softly. Quote 160. The words hit Martha like a physical blow, draining the strength from her arms and making the rifle waver in her grip. Kenneth had risked his life to protect her, and now he was dead because of her need for help. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to maintain focus on the immediate threat. Quote 166. Martha said, though she feared the doctor was telling the truth. Dr. Morris reached into his medical bag and withdrew a syringe filled with clear liquid. Quote 167 Mom, he said calmly. Quote 168. Martha stared at the syringe in Dr. Morris's hand, knowing that it contained the same poison that had killed 4 other women and their unborn children. The sight of the weapon that would end her life and that of her baby filled her with a rage that burned away her fear and uncertainty. She would not die quietly like the others, would not allow this madman to claim another victory in his twisted war against women who refused to accept his vision of their proper place. No, Martha said firmly, raising the rifle until it was pointed directly at Dr. Morris's head. Quote 170. Dr. Morris paused, apparently surprised by the steel in her voice. Quote 71. Martha's finger found the trigger, and she felt a strange calm settle over her as she prepared to take another human life. The baby moved within her womb, a reminder of what she was fighting to protect. Then we will see who is stronger, she said quietly. The standoff stretched between them, two people separated by only a few feet, but representing completely different visions of right and wrong. Dr. Morris held his syringe like a holy relic, convinced that he was performing a sacred duty. Martha gripped her rifle like a lifeline, knowing that it represented her only chance of survival. The tension was broken by the sound of voices outside the cabin, men calling to each other as they approached through the trees. Dr. Morris's expression shifted to one of annoyance, as if he were being interrupted during important work. Martha felt a flicker of hope that help might be arriving, though she could not imagine who would be coming to her aid. Quote 173, Dr. Morris said dryly. Quote, the cabin door burst open and 3 men entered with weapons drawn. Martha recognized Sheriff Collins immediately, his bulk filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene with calculating eyes. Behind him came 2 men she did not know, both wearing the rough clothes of laborers or ranch hands. Their presence did not feel like rescue, and Martha's hope began to transform into a new kind of terror. Dr. Morris, Sheriff Collins said formally, I trust you have the situation well in hand. The casual greeting confirmed Martha's worst fears. Sheriff Collins was not here to arrest a murderer, but to assist one. The law enforcement officer who should have been protecting the women of Cedar Ridge was instead complicit in their deaths. The corruption ran deeper than she had imagined, involving not just one madman, but a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local authority. Dr. Morris replied, never taking his eyes off Martha. Quote 180. Sheriff Collins stepped fully into the cabin, his hand resting on his gun. Quote 78, he said reasonably. Quote weighty. Martha kept her rifle trained on Dr. Morris while trying to track the movements of the other men. She was outnumbered 4-1, and her pregnancy made her slow and clumsy. Even if she managed to shoot the doctor, the others would certainly kill her before she could reload. The situation seemed hopeless, but she refused to surrender without a fight. Quote 180, Martha asked, her voice breaking slightly. Quote 182. Sheriff Collins exchanged a glance with Dr. Morris before answering. Quote 183. He said simply, quote 184. The explanation revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. This was not simply about eliminating genetic weakness or reducing population pressure. It was about maintaining a social order where women existed only as extensions of male authority, where those who fell outside that structure were eliminated rather than supported. The pregnant widows had been murdered not because they were weak, but because they represented a threat to masculine control. Quote 185. Martha said, her voice growing stronger with anger. Quote 186. One of the unknown men laughed harshly. Quote 187, he said. Quote 188. Martha realized that further conversation was pointless. These men had convinced themselves that murder was justified, and no amount of moral argument would change their minds. Her only chance was to act before they could overwhelm her, to take as many of them with her as possible before they killed her and her unborn child. The baby kicked strongly within her womb, as if encouraging her to fight. Martha took a deep breath and made her decision. She would not die passively like the other women, would not allow these monsters to claim victory without paying a price. If she was going to die, she would die fighting. Martha pulled the trigger, and the rifle roared in the confined space of the cabin. Dr. Morris staggered backward, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had struck him. Blood seeped between his fingers, and the syringe fell from his hand to shatter on the wooden floor. The other men shouted in surprise and began drawing their weapons, but Martha was already working to reload. Sheriff Collins raised his gun, but before he could fire, the cabin windows exploded inward as gunshots erupted from outside. The sheriff spun around, blood blooming across his chest, and collapsed to the floor. The two unknown men dove for cover as bullets continued to pour through the windows, splintering wood and sending glass flying through the air. Martha pressed herself against the wall, trying to protect her belly from the flying debris while struggling to understand what was happening. Someone outside was shooting at the men who had come to kill her, but she could not identify her unexpected rescuer. The gunfire was precise and deadly, suggesting military training and experience with combat. Through the chaos, she heard a familiar voice shouting commands from outside. Kenneth Lee was alive, and he had brought help. Martha felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized that Dr. Morris had been lying about Kenneth's death. The trap that was supposed to eliminate her had instead become a trap for the killers themselves. Dr. Morris was still conscious despite his wound, pressing his back against the cabin wall while trying to stop the bleeding from his shoulder. "This changes nothing," he gasped. "You cannot protect her forever. Others will come, others who understand the necessity of what we are doing." Martha looked down at the broken syringe on the floor, its deadly contents spreading across the wooden planks. "How many others?" she demanded. "How many people in Cedar Ridge know about the murders?" Dr. Morris smiled through his pain. "Enough," he said simply. "More than enough to ensure that our work continues even if some of us fall." The admission sent a chill through Martha's body. The conspiracy was larger than she had imagined, involving multiple people in positions of authority and influence. Even if Kenneth succeeded in eliminating the immediate threat, there would be others waiting to take their place. Cedar Ridge had become a place where pregnant widows could not survive, where the very people who should have protected them had become their executioners. The gunfire outside began to diminish, replaced by the sounds of men shouting and running through the forest. Martha heard Kenneth's voice again, closer now, calling her name and asking if she was unharmed. She tried to answer but found that her voice had deserted her, leaving her able only to sob with relief and exhaustion. Kenneth appeared in the doorway, his rifle still smoking from recent use. His gray eyes swept the cabin, taking in the wounded doctor, the dead sheriff, and the two men who were slowly raising their hands in surrender. When his gaze found Martha still pressed against the wall with her own rifle clutched to her chest, his expression softened with something that might have been relief or admiration. "Are you hurt?" Kenneth asked, moving carefully into the cabin while keeping his weapon trained on the surviving conspirators. Martha shook her head, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The baby moved within her, and she pressed her hands to her belly, grateful that they had both survived the confrontation. "Dr. Morris," she managed to whisper. "He admitted to killing the others. He said there are more people involved." Kenneth's jaw tightened as he looked down at the wounded doctor. "Quote one and then," he demanded. Dr. Morris's smile widened despite his pain. "You will never find them all," he said weakly. "We are everywhere in every position of trust and authority. The work will continue long after I am gone." Kenneth stepped closer to the doctor, his expression dangerous. "Give me names or I will let you bleed to death on this floor." Dr. Morris laughed, a sound that was more cough than humor. "You think you have won something here tonight," he said. "But this is only the beginning. There are others who understand the necessity of maintaining order, of preventing the weak from dragging down the strong. They will not be as careless as we were." The threat in Dr. Morris's words was clear, but before Kenneth could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the cabin door. Martha tensed, wondering if more conspirators were arriving to finish what the doctor had started. Kenneth positioned himself between her and the doorway, his rifle ready for whatever new threat might emerge from the darkness. To Martha's surprise, the voice that called out from the night belonged to a woman. "Kenneth Lee, are you in there? This is Catherine Ramirez. I have brought help." Kenneth lowered his weapon slightly, though he remained alert. "Come in slowly," he called back. "Keep your hands visible." Catherine Ramirez entered the cabin followed by two men Martha did not recognize. The store owner looked older than her 40 years, her dark hair streaked with premature gray and her face lined with the stress of frontier life. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, and her eyes held an intelligence that missed nothing. "I see you found them," Catherine said, surveying the scene with grim satisfaction. "Sheriff Collins and Dr. Morris, working together just as I suspected." Kenneth nodded toward the wounded doctor. "He admitted to killing the pregnant widows, said there are others involved in the conspiracy. We need to get him medical attention so he can be questioned properly." Catherine's expression hardened. Quote 211, she repeated. Quote how? Martha understood Catherine's anger, but she also recognized the practical necessity of keeping Dr. Morris alive. "He is the only one who can identify the other conspirators," she said quietly. "If he dies, we may never know who else is involved." One of the men who had arrived with Catherine stepped forward, and Martha saw that he wore a badge identifying him as a territorial marshal. "Ma'am is right," he said in a voice that carried the authority of federal law enforcement. "We need this man alive and talking if we are going to clean up this mess." The marshal was a tall, weathered man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who had spent years dealing with frontier violence. His presence suggested that the conspiracy had attracted attention from higher authorities, that the murders in Cedar Ridge were part of a larger pattern of corruption and abuse. "Marshal Zachary Lewis," the man introduced himself to Kenneth and Martha. "I have been investigating reports of suspicious deaths in several frontier communities. Cedar Ridge is not the only place where pregnant widows have been dying under mysterious circumstances." The revelation sent a chill through Martha's body. The horror she had experienced was not unique to her community, but part of a broader campaign of terror targeting vulnerable women across the territory. The scope of the conspiracy was larger and more organized than she had imagined. Kenneth asked grimly. Marshal Lewis's expression was grave. "At least 6 that we know of, probably more. The pattern is always the same. Pregnant widows dying of apparent natural causes within weeks of their husbands' deaths. Local authorities either incompetent or complicit, medical professionals providing cover for what are actually murders." Dr. Morris laughed weakly from his position against the wall. "You have no idea how deep this goes," he said. "How many people understand the necessity of what we do? You can arrest me, arrest all of us, but others will take our place. The work is too important to be stopped by a few bleeding hearts." Marshal Lewis knelt beside the wounded doctor, his expression cold and professional. "We will see about that," he said quietly. "I have been tracking this conspiracy for 2 years, and I know more about your organization than you think. The territorial authority has had enough of your vigilante justice." The mention of an organization confirmed Martha's worst fears. The murders were not the work of isolated madmen, but part of a coordinated effort involving multiple communities and numerous conspirators. The pregnant widows had been targeted by what amounted to a terrorist organization, one that used medical and legal authority to eliminate women they deemed undesirable. Catherine moved to Martha's side, her expression filled with sympathy and understanding. "I am sorry you had to go through this," she said softly. "When Kenneth came to me tonight and explained what was happening, I knew we had to act quickly. I contacted Marshal Lewis, and we gathered what help we could." Martha looked around the cabin at the dead and wounded men who had come to kill her, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. "How did you know?" she asked Catherine. "How did you know they were involved?" Catherine's expression darkened with old pain. Quote 229, she said simply. Quote 230. The admission explained Catherine's willingness to help and her knowledge of the conspiracy's operations. She had been fighting the same battle as Martha, seeking justice for a loved one who had been murdered for threatening the organization's activities. Her husband had died trying to protect women he had never met, and his sacrifice had ultimately led to the exposure of the killers. Kenneth moved to secure the 2 surviving conspirators, while Marshal Lewis began treating Dr. Morris's wound. The federal lawman worked with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with similar situations before, stopping the bleeding while ensuring that his patient remained conscious and able to answer questions. Marshal Lewis said to Dr. Morris, Quote 132. Dr. Morris's smile had faded, replaced by a grimace of pain and growing awareness that his cause was lost. "You think you can stop us with arrests and trials," he said weakly. "But we are fighting for the survival of civilization itself. Someone has to make the hard choices, has to eliminate the weak before they drag everyone down." Marshall Lewis's expression remained impassive. Tapetari 35, he said. Kuti 36. The threat seemed to penetrate Dr. Morris's delusions, and Martha saw fear flicker in his pale eyes. There is a council, he said reluctantly, representatives from each community, coordinating our efforts. They meet quarterly to share information and plan operations. Where, Marshall Lewis demanded. Dr. Morris hesitated, and Martha could see him calculating whether cooperation might save his life. Copper Creek, he said finally. The old mining office. The next meeting is scheduled for the end of the month. Martha felt a chill as she realized how close they had come to walking into a trap. Kenneth's plan to take her to the abandoned homestead near Copper Creek would have placed them directly in the path of the conspiracy's leadership. The isolation that had seemed like protection would have made them easy targets for elimination. Marshall Lewis nodded grimly and continued his questioning, extracting details about the organization's structure and operations. Martha listened in growing horror as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. What had begun as isolated incidents of vigilante justice had evolved into a coordinated campaign of terror spanning multiple territories. The organization called itself the Natural Order Society, and its members believed that frontier communities could only survive through strict control of population and resources. Pregnant widows represented what they saw as genetic and social weakness. Women who would produce children that would drain community resources without contributing to their defense or prosperity. Quote 242. Kenneth asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Dr. Morris was growing weaker, his voice becoming more difficult to hear. He whispered. The admission painted a picture of corruption that reached into every level of frontier society. Martha realized that her experience in Cedar Ridge was being repeated in communities across the territory, that countless women had died because they had the misfortune to become pregnant widows in places where the Natural Order Society held influence. Catherine knelt beside Martha, offering support as the full weight of the revelation settled over them. She said softly. Martha nodded, but she could not shake the feeling that their victory was only temporary. Dr. Morris had been right about one thing. The organization was too large and too well established to be destroyed by the exposure of a single cell. There would be others in other communities, continuing the work of eliminating women they deemed unfit to survive. Marshall Lewis finished bandaging Dr. Morris's wound and turned his attention to the two surviving conspirators. Both men had remained silent throughout the interrogation, their faces showing a mixture of defiance and fear. Martha could see that they remained committed to their cause despite witnessing the collapse of their local operation. Jennifer Morgan, one of the men said suddenly, his voice filled with venom. She runs the boarding house on Main Street. Pregnant widow. Husband died in a mine accident 3 weeks ago. She is next on the list. The revelation sent a jolt of terror through Martha's body. While they had been fighting for her life, another pregnant widow had been marked for death. Jennifer Morgan was younger than Martha, barely 21, and her husband's death had left her completely alone in the world. She had no family nearby, no protection against the forces that had already claimed 4 other women. Kenneth was on his feet immediately, checking his weapons and preparing to leave. How long do we have? He asked Marshall Lewis. The federal lawman consulted a pocket watch, his expression grim. If they follow their usual pattern, she will be approached within the next few days, he said. We need to get to her before they do. Catherine stood as well, her jaw set with determination. I will come with you, she said. Jennifer trusts me, and she will need someone to explain what is happening. Martha struggled to her feet, ignoring the protest from Kenneth and Catherine. I am coming too, she said firmly. Jennifer needs to see that it is possible to survive, that there is hope even when everything seems lost. Kenneth shook his head. You are in no condition to be running around town, he said. You need rest, and you need to stay somewhere safe until we can be certain all the conspirators have been identified. Martha understood his concern, but she also knew that Jennifer Morgan would need more than just protection from male authority figures. She would need to hear from another woman who had faced the same terror and survived, who could offer the kind of understanding that no man could provide. She will not trust you, Martha said simply. Not after learning that the doctor and sheriff were trying to kill her. She needs to hear from someone who has been through what she is facing. Marshall Lewis nodded slowly. Ma'am has a point, he said. Trust is going to be a major issue in this community for some time. Having another pregnant widow vouch for our intentions could make the difference between cooperation and panic. Kenneth's expression showed his reluctance, but he eventually agreed to include Martha in the rescue mission. They would travel together to Jennifer Morgan's boarding house, where Marshall Lewis would place her under federal protection while they continued hunting for other members of the conspiracy. Dr. Morris had lapsed into unconsciousness, his breathing shallow but steady. Marshall Lewis arranged for him to be transported to the territorial capital, where he would face trial for multiple murders. The two surviving conspirators would accompany him, along with Sheriff Collins's body, as evidence of the corruption that had infected Cedar Ridge's law enforcement. As they prepared to leave Kenneth's cabin, Martha took a final look around the space that had provided her with temporary safety. The walls were scarred with bullet holes and bloodstains marked the floor where men had died fighting over her right to exist. It was a violent end to what had been a place of peace, but she felt no regret about the destruction. The baby moved within her womb, and Martha pressed her hands to her belly as they stepped out into the night air. The child she carried would be born into a world where pregnant widows could not take safety for granted, where organizations like the Natural Order Society worked to eliminate those they deemed unworthy of life. But at least her baby would be born alive, with a chance to grow up and perhaps help build a better world. Catherine walked beside Martha as they made their way toward town, offering support when the rough terrain made walking difficult. Quote 262, quote, she asked quietly. Quote 263, quote, Martha considered the question as they navigated the forest path. Cedar Ridge would never feel safe again, knowing how many of its citizens had been willing to participate in or ignore the murders of pregnant women. But leaving would mean abandoning the home she had built with Daniel, the memories they had created together in their brief time as husband and wife. Quote 264, Martha admitted. Quote and Kenneth, walking ahead of them, turned back at her words. Quote 1 he said. Quote 267. The mention of the other pregnant widow refocused Martha's attention on the immediate crisis. Somewhere in Cedar Ridge, a young woman was going about her daily routine, unaware that she had been marked for death by people she trusted. The thought of Jennifer suffering the same terror that Martha had experienced filled her with determination to prevent another tragedy. They reached the outskirts of town as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. Cedar Ridge looked peaceful in the early morning light, smoke rising from chimneys as families began their daily routines. It was hard to believe that such a normal-looking community had harbored killers who targeted the most vulnerable members of society. The boarding house where Jennifer Morgan lived stood near the center of town, a two-story structure that provided rooms for travelers and temporary residents. Martha had visited the establishment several times when Daniel was alive, and she remembered Jennifer as a quiet, hardworking young woman who took pride in maintaining clean, comfortable accommodations for her guests. As they approached the boarding house, Marshall Lewis held up a hand to halt their progress. Something is wrong, Sim, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the building for signs of danger. Martha followed his gaze and saw what had alarmed him. The front door stood slightly ajar, and no smoke rose from the chimney despite the early morning chill. The building had the empty feeling of a place where something terrible had happened, where life had been suddenly and violently interrupted. Kenneth drew his weapon and motioned for Martha and Catherine to stay back while he and Marshall Lewis approached the building. Martha watched with growing dread as the two men disappeared through the front door, their footsteps echoing in the silence that surrounded the boarding house. Minutes passed with no sound from inside the building. Martha found herself holding her breath, waiting for gunshots or shouts that would indicate the men had encountered resistance. Instead, there was only silence, broken occasionally by the sound of doors opening and closing as they searched the premises. When Kenneth finally emerged, his expression told Martha everything she needed to know. They were too late. Jennifer Morgan was dead, another victim of the Natural Order Society's campaign of terror. The young woman's life had been cut short just as she was beginning to recover from the loss of her husband. Her unborn child denied the chance to ever draw breath. How? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kenneth's jaw was tight with suppressed anger. He said grimly, the callousness of the deception filled Martha with rage. Not content with simply murdering Jennifer Morgan, the killers had tried to destroy her reputation as well, making it appear that she had abandoned her unborn child out of weakness and selfishness. It was a final insult to a woman who had already suffered more than anyone should have to endure. Marshal Lewis joined them outside the boarding house, his expression grim but determined. Quote 272, he said. Quote 273. The thought that Jennifer's killer was nearby, possibly observing their investigation, sent a chill through Martha's body. The Natural Order Society had proven itself capable of striking anywhere, at any time, using trusted members of the community to carry out their murders. No pregnant widow would be safe until every member of the organization was identified and eliminated. Quote 274, Martha asked. Marshal Lewis checked his weapons and surveyed the surrounding buildings. Quote 275, he said grimly. Quote 276. The plan to use Jennifer Morgan's death as bait required careful coordination and considerable risk. Marshal Lewis positioned himself in a building across from the boarding house, where he could observe anyone who showed unusual interest in the scene. Kenneth took up a position that allowed him to watch the approaches to the building, while Catherine spread word of the discovery through the community. Martha found herself assigned the most difficult role. She was to remain visible and vulnerable, serving as bait to draw out any remaining conspirators who might see her as their next target. The strategy made sense from a tactical standpoint, but it required her to place herself in mortal danger while heavily pregnant and emotionally exhausted from the night's events. As word of Jennifer's death spread through Cedar Ridge, Martha watched the reactions of her neighbors with new eyes. Some showed genuine shock and grief at the loss of another young woman, but others displayed responses that seemed calculated or false. She began to understand how the conspiracy had operated so successfully for so long, hidden among people who appeared to be normal members of the community. The first suspicious reaction came from Karen Reed, the woman who ran the town's small restaurant. When Catherine informed her of Jennifer's death, Karen's initial expression showed what might have been satisfaction before being quickly replaced by appropriate sorrow. The brief glimpse of her true feelings suggested that she had been expecting the news, possibly even anticipating it. Martha made note of Karen's reaction while continuing to play her role as a grieving, vulnerable widow. She positioned herself on the boarding house porch, where anyone watching would see her apparent distress over Jennifer's fate. The performance felt wrong, using another woman's death as part of a deception, but she reminded herself that it was necessary to prevent future murders. The second suspicious reaction came from a man Martha had never seen before, someone who claimed to be a traveling merchant but showed far too much interest in the details of Jennifer's death. He asked specific questions about the timing and circumstances, information that would be important to conspirators trying to determine whether their operation had been compromised. Kenneth had noticed the stranger as well, and Martha saw him signal to Marshal Lewis that they had identified a potential target. The federal lawmen began moving into position, preparing to intercept the suspicious merchant when he attempted to leave town. As the morning progressed, other members of the community arrived to pay their respects or offer assistance. Martha found herself studying each face, searching for signs of deception or hidden knowledge. The process was exhausting and emotionally draining, forcing her to suspect people she had known for years. Nancy Johnson, the elderly woman who served as the town's unofficial midwife, showed particular interest in Martha's condition. She offered to examine her and provide care during the final months of her pregnancy, but something about her manner felt wrong. Nancy's questions seemed designed to gather information rather than provide medical assistance, and her eyes held the same calculating look that Martha had seen in Dr. Morris. "You must be terrified," Nancy said, her voice filled with false sympathy. "All these young mothers dying so suddenly, so tragically. It makes one wonder if there is some curse on pregnant women in Cedar Ridge." The comment was clearly designed to gauge Martha's knowledge of the conspiracy. Nancy was testing whether Martha understood that the deaths were murders rather than coincidences, probing for information that might indicate how much the investigation had uncovered. Quote 279. Martha replied carefully. Quote 280. Nancy nodded sagely, her expression suggesting deep concern. She said, "The suggestion that Martha leave town confirmed her suspicions about Nancy's involvement in the conspiracy. The elderly midwife was either trying to drive her away from potential protection or attempting to isolate her from witnesses who might interfere with a planned murder." Martha felt the baby move strongly within her womb, as if the child sensed the danger that surrounded them. The movement reminded her of what she was fighting to protect, strengthening her resolve to see the investigation through to its conclusion. "I appreciate your concern," Martha said, "but I feel safer staying close to home during these difficult times." Nancy's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance or calculation. Quote 285, as she said. Quote 286 found, the casual acceptance of the suicide story confirmed Nancy's involvement in the conspiracy. A genuine midwife would have questioned the circumstances of Jennifer's death, would have found it difficult to believe that a pregnant woman would kill herself and her unborn child. Nancy's willingness to accept the official explanation suggested that she knew the truth behind the apparent suicide. As Nancy prepared to leave, she made one final offer that revealed the extent of her knowledge. "If you change your mind about seeking help elsewhere, I know of a physician in Copper Creek who has experience with cases like yours. Dr. Harrison specializes in women who have lost their husbands during pregnancy." The mention of Copper Creek, the location where the Natural Order Society held its meetings, was clearly not a coincidence. Nancy was either trying to send Martha into a trap or testing whether she knew about the organization's activities in that area. Martha thanked Nancy for her advice while mentally adding her name to the list of suspected conspirators. The revelation that the town's midwife was involved in the murders explained how the killers had been able to approach pregnant women without arousing suspicion. Nancy's position gave her access to intimate information about expectant mothers, knowledge that would be invaluable to anyone planning their elimination. After Nancy left, Martha remained on the boarding house porch, continuing her role as bait while processing the magnitude of what she had discovered. The conspiracy reached into every aspect of community life, involving people who held positions of trust and authority. The pregnant widows had been betrayed not just by individuals, but by the entire social structure that was supposed to protect them. Kenneth approached the porch, his expression indicating that he had observed Nancy's visit and drawn similar conclusions. "How many more do you think there are?" he asked quietly. Martha considered the question while watching the normal activities of Cedar Ridge continue around them. "Enough to make this feel like enemy territory," she said. "Enough that we cannot trust anyone until this is over." The baby kicked again, and Martha pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the strong movements of a child eager to be born. She wondered what kind of world she would be bringing her baby into, whether the corruption they had uncovered in Cedar Ridge was representative of conditions throughout the territory. Marshal Lewis appeared at her side, having completed his surveillance of the suspicious merchant. "We have identified at least 6 potential conspirators," he said quietly, "including the midwife who just visited you. It appears the organization has deeper roots in this community than we initially suspected." The news was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it meant they were making progress in identifying the conspiracy's members. Terrifying because it revealed how thoroughly the organization had infiltrated Cedar Ridge's social structure. "What happens next?" Martha asked. Marshal Lewis consulted his pocket watch, his expression grim but determined. "Now we begin making arrests," he said, starting with the people who showed the most suspicious behavior during our surveillance. "We will work our way through the list until we have identified every member of the organization." The prospect of justice for the murdered women filled Martha with satisfaction, but she also felt a deep sadness for the community that had been corrupted by the Natural Order Society's influence. Cedar Ridge would never be the same after the exposure of the conspiracy, and many innocent people would suffer from the loss of trust that would inevitably follow. As Marshal Lewis prepared to begin the arrests, Martha realized that her own ordeal was far from over. Even if they succeeded in eliminating the local cell of the Natural Order Society, there would be other communities where pregnant widows faced the same threats. The organization was too large and too well established to be destroyed by a single investigation. But at least her child would be born into a world where some people were willing to fight for justice, where federal marshals and ordinary citizens could work together to protect the innocent. It was not much, but it was enough to give her hope for the future. The baby moved again, and Martha smiled despite the danger that still surrounded them. Quote, "Tucka," she whispered to her unborn child. Quote, "Tonano." The arrest began at dawn, with Marshal Lewis coordinating a series of simultaneous raids across Cedar Ridge. Martha watched from Kenneth's cabin as federal agents and territorial deputies moved through the town like a cleansing wind, sweeping up the members of the Natural Order Society who had terrorized pregnant widows for months. The sight of Nancy Johnson being led away in shackles filled Martha with a grim satisfaction, knowing that the woman who had betrayed her position of trust would face justice for her crimes. Kenneth stood beside her at the window, his gray eyes tracking the movements of the law enforcement officers as they executed their carefully planned operation. 12 arrests so far, he reported quietly, including the mayor, 2 council members, and the bank president. The conspiracy reached deeper into the community leadership than anyone imagined. Martha pressed her hands to her swollen belly, feeling the baby's restless movements as if the child sensed the tension that still gripped Cedar Ridge. At 8 months pregnant, she was growing increasingly uncomfortable, her body preparing for the birth that would come within weeks. The thought of bringing a child into a world where such evil could flourish filled her with both determination and fear. Quote 300, Martha asked, watching as another suspected conspirator was escorted to the temporary jail that had been established in the old mining office. Quote 301, Kenneth was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he considered her question. He said finally, the truth of his words was already becoming apparent as Martha observed the reactions of the townspeople who had not been arrested. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who else might have been involved in the conspiracy. Families that had lived peacefully, side by side for years, now questioned every interaction, every conversation, searching for signs of deception they might have missed. Catherine Ramirez appeared at the cabin door, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who had spent the night helping coordinate the arrests. Quoto trio, she told Martha. Quote trio. Martha followed Catherine to the temporary command post that had been established in the church, the only building in Cedar Ridge large enough to accommodate the federal agents and their prisoners. Marshal Lewis looked up from a stack of documents as they entered, his weathered face showing both satisfaction and concern. He said without preamble, gesturing to the paper spread across the makeshift desk. R307. Martha felt a chill as she realized the scope of what had been prevented. The conspiracy that had claimed the lives of pregnant widows in Cedar Ridge and other towns was only the beginning of a much larger campaign. If Marshal Lewis had not intervened when he did, hundreds more women might have died. Quote 308, Martha asked, dreading the answer. Marshal Lewis consulted one of the documents, his expression grim. Quote 301, the magnitude of the loss was staggering. 47 women and their unborn children, murdered because they had the misfortune to become pregnant widows in communities where the Natural Order Society held influence. Each death represented not just a life cut short, but a future denied. Children who would never be born, families that would never exist. Marshal Lewis continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Quote 311. Martha felt Kenneth tense beside her, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Quote 312. She asked. Marshal Lewis handed her a letter written in Dr. Morris's precise handwriting. Read this, he said quietly. It explains why the conspiracy was so determined to eliminate you. Martha's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter and began to read. The document was addressed to someone identified only as the council chairman, and it detailed Dr. Morris's assessment of the pregnant widows in Cedar Ridge. Most of the women were described in clinical terms, their supposed weaknesses and vulnerabilities cataloged with cold precision. But the section about Martha was different, filled with a venom that revealed the true motivation behind her targeting. Dr. Morris had written extensively about her intelligence, her strength of will, and her refusal to accept the traditional role assigned to widowed women. He had identified her as a potential leader, someone who might inspire other women to resist the organization's efforts to control and eliminate them. Quote 3.5, the letter read, quote, Martha lowered the letter, feeling a mixture of anger and strange pride at Dr. Morris's assessment. The conspiracy had targeted her not because she was weak, but because she was strong. Not because she was helpless, but because she represented a threat to their vision of how society should function. They were afraid of you, Kenneth said quietly, his voice filled with something that might have been admiration. Afraid of what you might become, what you might teach your children. The realization transformed Martha's understanding of everything that had happened to her. The months of terror, the constant fear of death, the desperate flight from one hiding place to another, all of it had been motivated not by her vulnerability, but by her strength. The Natural Order Society had seen her as dangerous enough to require elimination, and that recognition filled her with a fierce pride. Quote 3-1, and Martha said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Quote, drunken Marshall Lewis smiled at her defiant words. Quote, ton, he said. Quote, Tidbound. Catherine placed a supportive hand on Martha's shoulder. The question now is what you want to do with that strength, she said. Cedar Ridge will need leaders as it rebuilds, people who understand what happened here and can help prevent it from happening again. Martha considered the suggestion while feeling the baby move within her womb. The child she carried would be born into a world forever changed by the events of the past few months, a world where the comfortable assumptions about community and trust had been shattered. But it would also be a world where justice had been served, where ordinary people had stood up to organized evil and won. I want to stay, Martha said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. This is my home, the place where Daniel and I plan to raise our family. I will not let the Natural Order Society drive me away from the life we built here. Kenneth nodded approvingly. The town will need people like you, he said, people who understand the price of freedom and are willing to fight to preserve it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a territorial deputy with news that would change everything. Marshal Lewis, the man said breathlessly, we have a problem. The prisoners are claiming that their arrests were illegal, that they were acting under the authority of territorial law. Marshal Lewis's expression darkened as he processed the implications of the deputy's report. What kind of territorial law? The deputy consulted his notes, his face showing confusion and concern. Something called the Community Stability Act, passed by the territorial legislature last year. According to the prisoners, it gives local authorities broad powers to eliminate threats to community welfare, including what they call socially destabilizing individuals. Martha felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what the deputy was describing. The Natural Order Society had not been operating outside the law. They had been operating under a law specifically designed to legitimize their actions. The territorial government had provided legal cover for the murder of pregnant widows, making their elimination not just permissible, but officially sanctioned. That is impossible, Catherine said, her voice filled with disbelief. No legitimate government would pass a law authorizing murder. Marshal Lewis was already moving toward the door, his expression grim with purpose. I need to see those documents, he said. If what the prisoners are claiming is true, then this conspiracy reaches far beyond Cedar Ridge, far beyond anything we imagined. Martha followed the marshal to the temporary jail, her mind reeling from the implications of what they had learned. If the territorial government had indeed passed legislation authorizing the elimination of pregnant widows, then the Natural Order Society was not a criminal organization, but an official arm of territorial policy. The women who had died had been murdered not by rogue conspirators, but by agents of the state itself. Dr. Morris looked up from his cell as they approached, his pale eyes showing a satisfaction that chilled Martha to the bone. I told you this was bigger than you understood, he said smugly. We were not criminals, we were patriots, carrying out the will of the territorial government. Marshal Lewis demanded to see the legal documents that the prisoners claimed authorized their actions. What he found in their possession made Martha's worst fears seem optimistic by comparison. The Community Stability Act was real, passed quietly by the territorial legislature, and signed into law by the governor himself. The legislation was written in careful legal language that obscured its true purpose, but the intent was unmistakable. It granted local authorities the power to eliminate individuals deemed threats to community stability, with pregnant widows specifically identified as a category of person likely to require intervention. The law provided complete immunity for officials acting under its provisions, making prosecution for murder impossible under territorial jurisdiction. Quote 339. Marshal Lewis said grimly. Quote 34. Martha felt the walls closing in around her as she realized the true scope of what they were facing. The Natural Order Society was not an isolated conspiracy, but part of a systematic campaign by the territorial government to eliminate women deemed undesirable. The pregnant widows had been murdered not by criminals, but by officials carrying out legal mandates. Kenneth asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Marshal Lewis studied the legal documents with the careful attention of someone who understood the complexities of jurisdictional law. He said finally, quote 343, the legal battle that lay ahead would be complex and dangerous, involving challenges to territorial authority that could have far-reaching consequences. But Martha found herself feeling more determined than afraid. The revelation that the murders had been officially sanctioned only strengthened her resolve to fight for justice. Catherine asked, Marshal Lewis gathered the documents and prepared to send them to the territorial capital for analysis. He said, Martha remembered Dr. Morris's earlier admission about the organization's quarterly meetings at Copper Creek. Quote 347, she said suddenly. Quote 348. Marshal Lewis nodded approvingly. Quote 349. The investigation that followed consumed the next several days, with federal agents combing through the possessions and records of the arrested conspirators. What they found painted a picture of an organization far more sophisticated and far-reaching than anyone had imagined. The Natural Order Society had indeed operated across multiple territories, coordinating their activities through regular meetings and shared intelligence. More disturbing was the discovery that the organization had supporters at the highest levels of territorial government. The Community Stability Act had been drafted not by elected officials, but by Natural Order Society members who had infiltrated the legislative process. The law was not a legitimate exercise of governmental authority, but a criminal conspiracy disguised as legislation. Martha watched the investigation unfold while dealing with the increasing discomfort of her advancing pregnancy. The baby was due within weeks, and she found herself caught between the desire to see justice done and the need to prepare for childbirth. Kenneth had arranged for a midwife from a neighboring territory to attend the birth, someone with no connection to Cedar Ridge or the conspiracy that had infected it. Quote 350. Kenneth asked one evening as they sat together in his cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Martha considered the question while feeling the baby's strong movements within her womb. Not of giving birth, she said finally. Not anymore. I am afraid of what kind of world I am bringing this child into, afraid that there might be other places where organizations like the Natural Order Society are still operating. Kenneth's expression was thoughtful as he gazed out at the peaceful landscape that surrounded Cedar Ridge. He said honestly. Martha found comfort in his words, in the quiet strength that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her ordeal. Kenneth Lee remained something of a mystery, a man whose past was shrouded in secrets, but whose commitment to protecting the innocent was absolute. She had learned not to question his motivations too closely, accepting that some people were simply compelled to stand against injustice regardless of the personal cost. The baby kicked strongly, and Martha smiled as she felt the child's restless energy. This little one is going to be a fighter, she said. I can already tell. Kenneth's expression softened as he watched her hands move protectively over her belly. Quote 357, he said quietly. The simple words carried a weight of meaning that made Martha's heart skip a beat. Over the months they had spent together, facing danger and uncertainty, something had grown between them that went beyond simple protection and gratitude. She had come to rely on Kenneth's strength and wisdom, while he seemed to find purpose in her determination and courage. Quote 358. Martha began, then stopped, uncertain how to express the feelings that had been building within her. He seemed to understand what she was trying to say without words. He said softly. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marshal Lewis with news that would determine the fate of everyone involved in the conspiracy. Quote 361. He announced as he entered the cabin. Quote 362. Martha felt a surge of relief so powerful that it brought tears to her eyes. Quote 363. Marshal Lewis's smile was grim but satisfied. It will be challenged in federal court as an unconstitutional violation of due process rights. The legal experts believe it will be struck down, which means that everyone who acted under its authority can be prosecuted for murder. The news meant that justice would finally be served for the women who had died, that their murders would not be dismissed as legal executions under territorial authority. Dr. Morris and his fellow conspirators would face trial for their crimes, and the organization that had terrorized pregnant widows across multiple territories would be destroyed. How long will the trials take? Catherine asked. Marshal Lewis consulted his notes. Months, possibly years. The legal challenges will be complex, and the defendants will fight every step of the way. But the evidence is overwhelming, and federal prosecutors are confident of conviction. Martha nodded, accepting that justice would be a long and difficult process. What about Cedar Ridge? What happens to the town while all this is being resolved? Marshall Lewis's expression grew more serious. He said, quote 369, "The challenge of rebuilding Cedar Ridge seemed almost as daunting as surviving the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed it. The town would need new leadership, new institutions, new ways of ensuring that vulnerable members of the community were protected rather than eliminated. It would require the kind of sustained effort that could only come from people who were committed to creating something better than what had existed before." Quote 370, Martha said with quiet determination. Quote 371, Kenneth nodded approvingly. Quote 372, he warned. Quote 373, Martha understood the challenge that lay ahead, but she also understood that she had no choice but to meet it. The child she carried would grow up in whatever kind of community she and others created in Cedar Ridge. If she wanted her baby to live in a world where pregnant widows were protected rather than murdered, then she would have to help build that world herself. The baby moved again, and Martha felt a sudden, sharp pain that made her gasp. Kenneth was beside her instantly, his face showing concern as he helped her to a chair. Quote 374, he asked. Martha breathed through the pain, trying to assess whether this was the beginning of labor or simply another false alarm. The baby was not due for another 2 weeks, but she had learned that children arrived on their own schedule, regardless of human expectations. Quote 375, she said as another contraction gripped her body. Quote 376, Catherine arrived within minutes of Kenneth's urgent summons, bringing with her the midwife who had been standing by for the past week. Sarah Chen was a small, efficient woman in her 50s who had delivered hundreds of babies throughout the territory. Her calm competence was exactly what Martha needed as the contractions grew stronger and more frequent. First babies often take their time, Sarah said as she examined Martha and confirmed that labor had indeed begun. But this little one seems eager to meet the world. We should prepare for a relatively quick delivery. Kenneth retreated to the barn as Sarah and Catherine took charge of the birth preparations. Martha found herself grateful for the presence of other women during this most intimate and vulnerable moment. The thought of bringing her child into the world surrounded by people she trusted filled her with a peace she had not expected to feel. The labor progressed steadily through the night, with Martha drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. Each contraction brought her child closer to birth, closer to the moment when she would finally hold the baby she had protected through months of terror and uncertainty. The pain was intense but purposeful, a reminder that she was engaged in the most important work of her life. "You are doing beautifully," Sarah encouraged, as dawn began to lighten the windows of the cabin. "The baby is in perfect position, and everything is proceeding normally. Just a little longer now." Martha gripped Catherine's hand as another powerful contraction swept through her body. Through the window, she could see the first rays of sunlight, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold. It seemed fitting that her child would be born with the sunrise, entering a world that was emerging from its own darkness into the possibility of light. "Quote," Sarah announced with excitement. "Quote." Martha gathered every ounce of strength she possessed and pushed with all her might. She felt her child slip free from her body in a rush of fluid and relief, heard the first angry cry that announced a new life had entered the world. Tears streamed down her face as Sarah placed the baby on her chest, a perfect little person with dark hair and strong lungs. Quote 383, Sarah said with satisfaction. Quote 384. Martha looked down at her baby girl and felt her heart expand with a love so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. This tiny person had been worth every moment of fear and pain, every risk and sacrifice. She was perfect and beautiful and alive, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of determination. Quote 385. Martha whispered, stroking her daughter's soft cheek, "Welcome to the world. We have been waiting for you." The baby's cries gradually subsided as she settled against Martha's warm skin, instinctively seeking the comfort and security of her mother's embrace. Martha marveled at the miracle of this new life. This child who had survived everything that had threatened them both and emerged victorious. Catherine wiped tears from her own eyes as she watched the tender scene. Line 387. Martha had been thinking about names for months, but now that her daughter was actually here, only one seemed appropriate. Koturan, she said softly. Kotukran. The name carried all the weight of what they had endured and overcome, all the promise of what the future might hold. Hope Martin would grow up in a world where justice had been served, where the people who had murdered pregnant widows had been held accountable for their crimes. She would know that her mother had refused to surrender, had fought for the right to bring her safely into the world. Kenneth appeared in the doorway, his gray eyes soft with emotion as he looked at Martha and her newborn daughter. Quote 390, he said quietly. Quote 3091. Martha smiled up at him, feeling a contentment that had been missing from her life for far too long. Class 392. Kenneth's hands were gentle as he took the baby, his large frame somehow perfectly suited to cradling the tiny child. Hope looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed to see everything, and Martha felt her heart skip as she watched the man who had protected them both fall under her daughter's whelm. Quote 393, Kenneth said, his voice filled with wonder. Quote to 3. Martha knew he was right. Hope had survived everything that had threatened her before birth, had chosen to enter the world at a time when the forces arrayed against her had finally been defeated. She would grow up knowing that she was wanted and loved, that her mother had fought for her right to exist. Sarah finished her post-delivery care and pronounced both mother and baby healthy and strong. Quote 395, she told Martha. Quote 396. As the morning progressed, word of Hope's birth spread through Cedar Ridge, bringing visitors who wanted to welcome the newest member of the community. Marshal Lewis arrived with news that the federal prosecutors were confident of securing convictions in the conspiracy case, that the Natural Order Society would be completely dismantled. This little one will grow up in a safer world, he told Martha as he admired the sleeping baby. The work you did, the courage you showed, it made a difference for children who have not even been born yet. Martha understood that Hope's birth represented more than just the arrival of one child. She was a symbol of what was possible when people refused to surrender to evil, when they fought for the right to live and love and raise their children in safety. The pregnant widows who had died before her had not died in vain if their deaths had led to the exposure and destruction of the conspiracy that had claimed their lives. Catherine brought news that the territorial governor had been arrested on federal conspiracy charges, that the Community Stability Act had been declared unconstitutional by a federal judge. The legal framework that had legitimized the murder of pregnant widows was being dismantled piece by piece, ensuring that no other women would suffer the same fate. Quote 399, Martha asked as she nursed Hope for the first time, marveling at how naturally the baby took to feeding. Catherine smiled as she watched the intimate scene. Quote 400, she said simply. Quote 401. Martha nodded, understanding that the real work was just beginning. Destroying the Natural Order Society had been only the first step in creating a world where pregnant widows could live without fear, where children like Hope could grow up safe and loved. Building that world would require sustained effort from everyone who believed in justice and human dignity. Kenneth had been quietly observing from the corner of the room, and Martha could see that he was wrestling with some internal decision. Finally, he approached the bed where she sat holding Hope, his expression serious but determined. He said quietly. Martha looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his gray eyes. Quote 404, she said gently. Quote 400 fun. Kenneth shook his head. Quote 406, the implication of his words sent Martha's heart racing. The possibility of a future with Kenneth, of raising Hope with a man who had proven his commitment to protecting them both, filled her with a happiness she had not dared to imagine. Tell me, she said simply. Kenneth took a deep breath as if preparing to share a burden he had carried for years. My name is not really Kenneth Lee, he said quietly. It is Kenneth Lewis. Zachary Lewis is my brother. Martha felt her world shift as she processed this revelation. The federal marshal who had saved them all was Kenneth's brother, which explained how he had known to contact federal authorities, how he had understood the scope of the conspiracy they were facing. Quote 410, Kenneth continued. Quote 411. Martha understood now why Kenneth had been so capable, so prepared for the violence they had faced. His mysterious past had not been criminal but tragic. The story of a man who had lost his way and found redemption in protecting others. Quote 441. Martha asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know the answer. Kenneth's expression was filled with old pain. I trusted the wrong people, believed in a conspiracy theory that turned out to be false. My investigation led to the deaths of 3 innocent families before I realized how wrong I was. I resigned in disgrace and came here to try to disappear. Martha reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his exile. But you did not disappear, she said softly. You found a way to make amends. Kenneth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Bartart Forslags, he said simply. Quote 417. Hope stirred in Martha's arms, making soft baby sounds that drew their attention back to the present moment. Martha looked down at her daughter and then up at Kenneth, seeing the future spread out before them like an uncharted territory full of possibility. What are you asking me? Martha said, though she thought she already knew. Kenneth knelt beside the bed, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I am asking if you will let me help you raise her, he said. If you will let me be the father she deserves, the husband you deserve. I am asking if you will marry me and build a life together here in Cedar Ridge. Martha felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she looked at this man who had risked everything to protect her and her unborn child. Kenneth Lewis had found his redemption in their love, and she had found her strength in his unwavering support. Together they could build the kind of family and community that would honor the memory of the women who had died. Yes, Martha said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. Yes to marriage, Aussie. Yes to raising hope together. Yes to building something beautiful in this place that has seen so much darkness. Kenneth's smile transformed his entire face, revealing the joy that had been hidden beneath months of worry and determination. He leaned forward and kissed Martha gently, sealing the promise they had made to each other and to the child who would grow up knowing she was wanted and loved. Catherine wiped tears from her own eyes as she witnessed the tender scene. She said with satisfaction, Hope opened her dark eyes and looked up at her parents with the serious expression of someone who had already seen more of the world than most newborns. Martha could not help but feel that her daughter understood the significance of this moment, the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. Marshal Lewis arrived later that afternoon with the final news about the conspiracy prosecutions. Quote 425, he announced with satisfaction. Quote 426, Martha felt a deep satisfaction at the news, knowing that justice had finally been served for Eleanor Blackwood, Sarah Hendricks, Margaret Stone, Rebecca Walsh, and Jennifer Morgan. Their deaths had not been in vain if they had led to the destruction of the organization that had claimed their lives. Quote 427, Kenneth asked. Marshal Lewis's expression was grim but satisfied. The governor and 12 legislators have been arrested on federal conspiracy charges. The territorial government is being reorganized under federal oversight until new elections can be held. The Community Stability Act has been permanently struck down, and new laws are being written to protect vulnerable populations. The news meant that the corruption that had enabled the Natural Order Society would be rooted out completely, that new safeguards would be put in place to prevent similar conspiracies from taking hold. Hope would grow up in a world where pregnant widows were protected by law rather than targeted for elimination. As the weeks passed and Cedar Ridge began the slow process of healing, Martha found herself settling into a new routine centered around caring for Hope and planning for her marriage to Kenneth. The baby thrived, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. Her presence seemed to bring hope and renewal to a community that had been scarred by months of terror and betrayal. The wedding was planned for early spring when the mountain wildflowers would be in bloom and the harsh winter would have given way to the promise of new growth. Martha wanted Hope to be old enough to participate in the ceremony, to be part of the family they were creating together. Catherine had agreed to serve as matron of honor, while Marshal Lewis would stand as best man for his brother. The ceremony would be simple but meaningful, a celebration of love and commitment in a place that had learned the true value of both. Are you nervous about becoming a marshal's wife? Catherine asked one afternoon as they planned the wedding details. Martha considered the question while watching Kenneth play with Hope, marveling at how naturally he had taken to fatherhood. Not nervous, she said finally. Excited. Kenneth has found his purpose again, and I want to support him in whatever work lies ahead. Kenneth had indeed been offered a position with the Federal Marshal Service, working specifically on cases involving organized conspiracies against vulnerable populations. His experience with the Natural Order Society had given him unique insights into how such organizations operated, making him invaluable in preventing future tragedies. There will be travel, Kenneth had warned her when he first discussed the offer. Cases that take me away from home for weeks at a time. I do not want to accept if it means leaving you and Hope alone. Martha had encouraged him to take the position, understanding that his work would help protect other women from suffering as she had suffered. We will manage, she had assured him, and when you come home, you will know that you have made a difference. The decision to remain in Cedar Ridge had not been easy, given the painful memories associated with the town. But Martha had come to understand that running away would not heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Only by staying and working to build something better could she truly honor the memory of Daniel and the women who had died. Hope was thriving in the mountain air, growing plump and healthy under the care of her devoted parents. Martha marveled at how quickly the baby was developing, how alert and responsive she had become. It seemed impossible that this perfect little person had once been threatened by the same forces that had claimed so many other children. She is going to be extraordinary, Kenneth said one evening as they watched Hope sleep in her cradle. I can see it already. The intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her grip. She is going to change the world. Martha smiled at his proud father's assessment, though she suspected he might be right. Hope had survived threats that would have destroyed a less determined child, had chosen to enter the world at exactly the moment when the forces arrayed against her had been defeated. She would grow up knowing that she was capable of overcoming any obstacle. The first anniversary of Daniel's death passed quietly, with Martha visiting his grave to tell him about their daughter and the man who had helped bring her safely into the world. She felt no guilt about her love for Kenneth, understanding that Daniel would have wanted her to find happiness and security for herself and their child. He would have liked Kenneth, Martha told Catherine as they walked back from the cemetery. They were similar men in many ways, good men who understood the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. Catherine nodded, understanding the complexity of Martha's feelings. She said, as spring approached and the wedding date drew near, Martha found herself looking forward to the future with an optimism she had not felt since before Daniel's death. Hope was growing stronger every day. Kenneth's love had given her a sense of security she had never known, and Cedar Ridge was slowly healing from the wounds inflicted by the Natural Order Society. The town had elected new leadership, including Catherine as mayor and several other women to the town council. The new government was committed to transparency and accountability, with strict safeguards to prevent the kind of corruption that had enabled the conspiracy to flourish. Quote 442. Catherine told Martha as they discussed plans for the town's future. A community where women have an equal voice in governance, where vulnerable populations are protected rather than exploited. Martha understood that they were indeed breaking new ground, challenging assumptions about how frontier communities should be organized and governed. Hope would grow up in a place where women's voices were heard and valued, where pregnant widows would never again face the kind of terror that had nearly claimed Martha's life. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the mountain peaks covered in fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Martha dressed carefully in a simple white gown that Catherine had helped her sew, her heart full of joy as she prepared to marry the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered. Hope wore a tiny dress of pale yellow silk, her dark eyes bright with curiosity as she took in the preparations around her. At 4 months old, she was alert and responsive, seeming to understand that this was an important day for her family. Kenneth waited at the altar they had set up in the church, his gray eyes shining with happiness as Martha walked down the aisle carrying their daughter. Marshall Lewis stood beside his brother, proud of the man Kenneth had become and the family he was creating. Dearly beloved, the new minister began, we are gathered here today to witness the union of two people who have found love in the midst of hardship, who have chosen to build a future together despite the challenges they have faced. Martha listened to the familiar words with new appreciation, understanding how precious and fragile love could be. She and Kenneth had found each other in the darkest of circumstances, had built trust and affection through shared danger and mutual support. Their love had been tested by forces that would have destroyed lesser relationships, and it had emerged stronger than ever. Do you, Kenneth Lewis, take Martha Martin to be your wife, to love and cherish her in sickness, in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live? Kenneth's voice was strong and clear as he made his vows. Quote 447, quote for him. Martha looked into Kenneth's gray eyes and saw her future reflected there, a future full of love and possibility and hope. I do. I promise to stand beside Kenneth as his partner and equal, to support him in his work and share with him the eyes and challenges of raising our daughter. The minister smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Kenneth's kiss was gentle and reverent, a seal on the promises they had made to each other and to hope. The small congregation erupted in applause, celebrating not just a wedding but a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy them. As they walked down the aisle as a family, Martha felt the weight of all they had endured and overcome. Hope gurgled contentedly in her arms, seemingly delighted by the celebration around her. Kenneth's hand was warm and strong in hers, a reminder of the protection and love that had brought them to this moment. The reception was held in Catherine's store, which had been decorated with wildflowers and ribbons for the occasion. The entire community had turned out to celebrate, including many of the federal agents who had helped expose the Natural Order Society conspiracy. It was a gathering that would have been impossible during the dark days when the town was controlled by those who sought to eliminate pregnant widows. Quote 451 as Marshall Lewis said, raising his glass in a toast. Quote 4521, Martha felt tears of happiness streaming down her face as she looked around at the faces of people who had become her chosen family. Catherine, who had risked everything to help expose the conspiracy. Marshall Lewis, who had brought federal justice to Cedar Ridge. The other townspeople who had supported her through the darkest days of her ordeal. Quote 453. Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. Quote 454. Kenneth stood beside her, Hope sleeping peacefully in his arms, and Martha felt a contentment that she had never imagined possible. The baby who had been threatened before birth was now safe and loved, surrounded by a community that would protect and nurture her as she grew. As the celebration continued into the evening, Martha found herself thinking about the women who had not lived to see this day. Eleanor Blackwood, Sarah Hendricks, Margaret Stone, Rebecca Walsh, Jennifer Morgan, all of them had deserved the chance to raise their children in safety and love. Their deaths had not been in vain if they had led to the creation of a world where other women could live without fear. Good to from Kenneth asked, noticing her momentary sadness. Martha looked down at Hope, who had awakened and was gazing up at her parents with bright, curious eyes. Quote 456, she said. Quote 47. Kenneth's expression grew serious as he considered her words. It will not be perfect, he warned. There will always be people who seek to harm the innocent, who believe that might makes right. But there will also be people like us, people who refuse to accept that evil must triumph. Martha nodded, understanding that the fight for justice was never truly over. But she also understood that each victory, each life saved, each child born safely into a world of love and protection was worth the struggle. She will know how to fight, Martha said, stroking Hope's soft cheek. Quote 461. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Martha and Kenneth found themselves alone with Hope in their new home. Kenneth had built an addition to his cabin, creating space for a growing family and the life they planned to build together. Kenneth asked as they prepared for bed, Hope sleeping peacefully in her new nursery. Martha considered the question, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. The terror and loss, the courage and determination, the love that had grown from shared hardship and mutual respect. Quote for her, she said. Quote for Kenneth kissed her gently, his gray eyes soft with love and contentment. Quote on, he said. Quote for Martha settled into his arms, feeling the peace that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Hope was safe, Kenneth was beside her, and the future stretched out before them, full of possibility and promise. The months that followed brought both challenges and joys as Martha and Kenneth settled into married life, while raising Hope and working to rebuild Cedar Ridge. Kenneth's work with the Federal Marshal Service took him away from home periodically, but he always returned with stories of justice served and conspiracies exposed. There was a group in Colorado trying to organize something similar to the Natural Order Society, he told Martha after one particularly long assignment. We shut them down before they could claim any victims. The work we did here, the precedent we set, it is making a difference across the territory. Martha felt pride in knowing that their struggle had helped protect other women from suffering the same fate as the pregnant widows of Cedar Ridge. Each conspiracy exposed, each organization disbanded, represented lives saved and families preserved. Hope was growing rapidly, developing into a bright, curious child who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both her parents. She had Martha's determination and Kenneth's quiet strength, combined with an intelligence that promised great things for her future. She is going to be a force to be reckoned with, Catherine observed during one of her frequent visits. I can see it already in the way she studies everything around her, the way she refuses to accept limitations. Martha smiled as she watched Hope attempt to crawl across the cabin floor, her little face set with determination as she struggled toward a toy that had caught her interest. She comes by it honestly, she said. She has seen what is possible when people refuse to give up. The first anniversary of their wedding was celebrated quietly, with just the immediate family gathered around the dinner table Kenneth had built with his own hands. Hope, now walking and beginning to talk, toddled between her parents with the confidence of a child who had never known fear or uncertainty. To another year of love and growth, Kenneth said, raising his glass in a toast. To the family we have built and the community we continue to create. Martha raised her own glass, her heart full of gratitude for the life they had created together. To Hope, she said, and to all the children who will grow up in the world we are building for them. As they sat together in the lamplight, Martha reflected on how far they had all come from the dark days when pregnant widows lived in terror of organized killers. Cedar Ridge had become a model for other communities, a place where justice and compassion took precedence over fear and hatred. Hope babbled happily in her high chair, her bright eyes taking in everything around her, with the curiosity of a child who knew she was loved and protected. She would grow up in a world where women's voices mattered, where vulnerable populations were protected, where love and justice could triumph over organized evil. What happened? Kenneth asked, noticing Martha's contemplative expression. Martha looked around the table at her family, then out the window at the town they had helped transform. I am thinking about how much can change in just 2 years, she said. How much hope can grow from the darkest circumstances. Kenneth followed her gaze to the lights of Cedar Ridge, twinkling in the valley below. We did that, he said quietly. All of us, working together. We took a place that had been poisoned by hatred and fear, and we made it into something beautiful. Hope clapped her hands and laughed, as if she understood and approved of their conversation. Martha reached over and stroked her daughter's dark hair, marveling at how this perfect little person had survived everything that had threatened her and emerged into a world of love and possibility. Quote 482, Martha said. Quote 483. Kenneth smiled at the thought. Quote 484, he said. Quote 485. As they prepared Hope for bed, Martha found herself thinking about the future with an optimism that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of her pregnancy. Hope would grow up strong and confident, surrounded by people who valued justice and compassion. She would know that she was capable of overcoming any obstacle, that love and determination could triumph over even the most organized forms of hatred. Quote 486, Hope said as Martha tucked her into bed, her vocabulary expanding daily as she grew more confident in her ability to communicate. Martha settled into the rocking chair beside Hope's bed, the same chair where she had nursed her daughter through those first precious months of life. Once upon a time, she began, there was a little girl who was born into a world that had been touched by darkness. But her mama and papa and all the good people in her town worked very hard to make sure that darkness could never hurt her. Hope listened with rapt attention, her dark eyes bright with interest as Martha told her a simplified version of their story. It was important that Hope understand her history, that she know she was part of something larger than herself, something that had required courage and sacrifice to achieve. And they all lived happily ever after? Hope asked when the story was finished. Martha kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood innocence and possibility. Quote 490, she corrected gently. Quote 491, Hope nodded solemnly, as if she understood the importance of what her mother was telling her. Quote 492 wow, she declared with the fierce determination that had already become her trademark. Martha smiled through tears of joy and pride. As Hope drifted off to sleep, Martha remained in the rocking chair, watching over her daughter and thinking about all the women who had not lived to see their children grow up safe and loved. Eleanor Blackwood, Sarah Hendricks, Margaret Stone, Rebecca Walsh, Jennifer Morgan, they had all deserved the chance to rock their babies to sleep, to tell them stories, to watch them grow into strong, confident adults. Their deaths had not been meaningless if they had led to the creation of a world where other children could grow up protected and cherished. Hope would carry their memory forward, would understand that her safety and happiness had been purchased with the sacrifice of women who had refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds. Kenneth appeared in the doorway, his expression soft with love as he watched Martha with their daughter. Martha nodded, rising carefully from the rocking chair so as not to wake Hope. Quote 495, she said quietly. Quote 496. Kenneth's eyes glistened with emotion as he looked down at Hope's peaceful face. Quote 490, he said. Quote 498. They stood together in the doorway of Hope's room, watching over the child who represented everything they had fought to protect and preserve. In the distance, Martha could hear the sounds of Cedar Ridge settling down for the night, families gathering around their own dinner tables, children being tucked into their own beds. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of a community that had learned to value justice and compassion over fear and hatred. Hope would grow up surrounded by that peace, confident in her right to exist and thrive, secure in the knowledge that she was part of something larger and more beautiful than herself. "Do you ever regret staying here?" Kenneth asked as they made their way to their own bedroom. "Sometimes I wonder if we should have taken Hope somewhere with no memories, no shadows from the past." Martha considered his question as she prepared for bed, thinking about the choice they had made to remain in Cedar Ridge and work to transform it rather than flee to somewhere untouched by their experiences. "No," she said finally, "this is where we belong. This is where Hope belongs." Running away would not have honored the memory of the women who died, would not have helped prevent future tragedies. Kenneth nodded, understanding her reasoning, even if he sometimes worried about the burden of living with such painful memories. "You are right," he said. "We are exactly where we need to be, doing exactly what we need to do." As they settled into bed together, Martha felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she was living a life of purpose and meaning. Hope was safe and loved. Kenneth was beside her, and their work was making a difference in the world. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for during the dark days when she had faced the Natural Order Society alone. "I love you," Kenneth whispered in the darkness, his arm tightening around her as they prepared for sleep. "I love you too," Martha replied, her heart full of gratitude for the man who had saved her life and helped her build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The years that followed brought continued growth and happiness for the Lewis family and the community of Cedar Ridge. Hope developed into a bright, confident child who showed early signs of the leadership qualities that would serve her well in the world her parents were helping to create. Kenneth's work with the Federal Marshal Service continued to take him away from home periodically, but each assignment brought news of progress in the fight against organized conspiracies targeting vulnerable populations. The precedent set by the Natural Order Society case had led to new federal legislation protecting pregnant widows and other at-risk groups. Quote 507, Kenneth reported after one particularly successful assignment. Quote 508. Martha felt deep satisfaction in knowing that their struggle had led to lasting change, that other women would never have to face the terror she had experienced during her pregnancy. The Natural Order Society had been completely dismantled, its members either imprisoned or driven underground, where they could no longer operate openly. Cedar Ridge had become a model for other communities seeking to rebuild after corruption and violence. Delegations of civic leaders visited regularly to study how the town had transformed itself from a place of fear and hatred into a beacon of justice and compassion. Code 509, Catherine told Martha during one of their regular planning meetings. Quote 510, while Martha was immediately interested in the proposal. Quote 511, she said. Quote 5, the school was established the following year, with Martha serving as one of the founding teachers and Hope among the first students. The curriculum included traditional subjects, but also emphasized critical thinking, civic responsibility, and the importance of protecting vulnerable members of society. Hope thrived in the school environment, showing particular aptitude for leadership and a natural ability to inspire others to work toward common goals. At the age of 5, she was already organizing her classmates to help with community service projects and standing up for children who were being bullied or excluded. Winner 3. Kenneth observed one evening as they watched Hope mediate a dispute between two of her friends. What's wrong? Martha smiled as she watched their daughter demonstrate the leadership skills that would serve her well in the years to come. Quote, "Palm," she said. Quote, "Fox." As Hope's 6th birthday approached, Martha found herself reflecting on how much their lives had changed since that terrible day when she had stood at Daniel's grave, pregnant and alone, facing an uncertain future. The child who had been threatened before birth was now a confident, happy little girl who knew she was loved and valued. Quote 517. Martha asked Kenneth one evening as they watched Hope practice reading to her younger classmates. Kenneth's expression was thoughtful as he considered her question. "I think Daniel would be amazed by what you have accomplished," he said. "You took the love he gave you and the strength you found within yourself, and you created something beautiful and lasting. Hope is growing up to be exactly the kind of person this world needs." The birthday celebration was held in the school, with children and families from across the community gathering to honor Hope and celebrate another year of growth and happiness. Martha looked around at the faces of people who had become their chosen family, marveling at how much love and support had grown from the ashes of tragedy. "6 years ago, I thought my story was ending," Martha told the gathered crowd. "I was pregnant and alone, facing forces that seemed determined to destroy everything I held dear. But this community, these people, showed me that every ending can become a new beginning if we have the courage to fight for what we believe in." Hope beamed with pride as her mother spoke, understanding even at her young age that she was part of something important and meaningful. She had grown up hearing stories about the brave people who had worked to make her world safe, and she was already showing signs of wanting to continue that work herself. "When I grow up, I want to be a marshal like Papa," Hope announced during her birthday speech. "I want to help protect people who cannot protect themselves, just like you protected me." Kenneth's eyes filled with tears of pride as he listened to his daughter's declaration. "Whatever you choose to become," he told her, "I know you will make a difference in the world." As the celebration continued into the evening, Martha found herself thinking about the future with an optimism that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of her pregnancy. Hope would grow up to be a leader, someone who understood the importance of fighting for justice and protecting the innocent. The world would be a better place because she existed. The final toast of the evening was offered by Catherine, who had become like a grandmother to Hope and a sister to Martha. "To Hope Lewis," she said, raising her glass high, "to the child who represents everything we fought to preserve, everything we continue to work to protect. May she grow up to be even braver and wiser than her parents. May she continue the work of building a world where every child can grow up safe and loved." Martha felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she looked around at the faces of people who had become her family, people who shared her commitment to justice and compassion. Hope was clapping enthusiastically, her bright eyes shining with happiness and the confidence that came from knowing she was surrounded by love. "Thank you," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all for helping us create this beautiful life, this beautiful community. Hope will grow up knowing that she is part of something larger than herself, something that requires courage and sacrifice to maintain." As the guests began to depart and the family prepared for bed, Martha found herself thinking about the women who had not lived to see their children reach this milestone. But she also found herself filled with hope for the future, knowing that their sacrifice had not been in vain if it had led to the creation of a world where children like Hope could grow up free from fear. "Mama," Hope said as Martha tucked her into bed, "will you tell me again about the brave ladies who helped make the world safe for me?" Martha settled into the familiar rocking chair, her heart full of love for this remarkable child who understood even at 6 years old that her safety and happiness had been purchased with the courage of others. "Once upon a time," she began, "there were women who refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds. They fought not just for themselves, but for all the children who would come after them. Hope listened with rapt attention, her dark eyes bright with interest and determination. She would grow up carrying the memory of those women forward, understanding that freedom and justice required constant vigilance and courage to maintain. And they all lived happily ever after? Hope asked, as she always did. Martha kissed her daughter's forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood innocence and infinite possibility. Quote 535, she said gently. Quote 536, Hope nodded solemnly, her young face serious with the weight of responsibility she was already beginning to understand. Quote 537, she promised. Quote 538. As Hope drifted off to sleep, Martha remained in the rocking chair, watching over her daughter and thinking about the future that stretched out before them. It would not be perfect. There would always be challenges and threats to overcome. But it would be a future built on the foundation of love and justice that had been established through so much struggle and sacrifice. The baby who had been threatened before birth had grown into a confident, compassionate child who understood her place in the world and her responsibility to help protect others. Hope Lewis would carry forward the legacy of the women who had died, ensuring that their sacrifice would continue to make a difference for generations to come. Outside the window, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled peacefully in the valley, a community transformed by the power of ordinary people who had refused to accept that evil must triumph. Martha smiled as she looked out at the town that had become home, the place where she had learned that love and determination could overcome even the most organized forms of hatred. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in the world. But tonight, Martha Lewis sat in her daughter's room, surrounded by the peace and security they had fought so hard to achieve, grateful beyond measure for the life they had built together from the ashes of tragedy and loss. Hope stirred in her sleep and smiled, as if dreaming of all the good she would do in the world. Martha reached over and gently stroked her daughter's hair, whispering a promise that would guide them both through whatever challenges lay ahead. Code 539, Martha whispered. Code 540. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the mountains, carrying travelers to new destinations and new possibilities. The sound seemed to symbolize the future itself, full of movement and change and hope. Martha closed her eyes and listened to the peaceful sounds of a community at rest, secure in the knowledge that they had built something beautiful and lasting from the darkness that had once threatened to consume them all. The pregnant widow, who had once stood alone at her husband's grave, facing an uncertain and terrifying future, had become a wife, mother, and leader who had helped transform an entire community. Her daughter would grow up knowing that courage and love could triumph over organized hatred, that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together for justice. It was more than Martha had ever dared to hope for during those dark days when death had seemed inevitable. But it was exactly what the women who had died before her would have wanted, exactly the kind of world they had dreamed their children might inherit. Hope Lewis would carry their memory forward, ensuring that their sacrifice would continue to make the world a better place for generations to come.